Good afternoon, and welcome to the 15th anniversary celebration of the World Justice Project. My name is Betsy Anderson. It's my privilege to serve as Executive Director of the WJP. To begin our program today, we'd like to share a brief video capturing the idea and impact of the World Justice Project. I think.
Every person on this planet deserves a fair shake. And far too many of them live in communities without justice and therefore without hope. That's intolerable.
Why do some communities thrive while others struggle? This question inspired the creation of the World Justice Project, and an audacious idea that's changing the world. What if the most critical thing a community needs isn't wealth, health, or education, but the invisible foundation that makes all of that possible, the rule of law? We decided to test our idea and do something that had never been done. We set out to measure the rule of law and how well it protects people from abuse of power, corruption, and injustices, big and small. From surveying thousands of experts and citizens in a handful of countries 15 years ago, we've expanded each year. Today, the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index covers over 140 countries and 95% of the world's people. Now the whole world can see what our research makes clear. Where rule of law is stronger, so is the economy, education, health, and peace. We're proud to spread this message and bring people together to tackle the rule of law gaps and troubling trends our data reveals. We identify solutions, celebrate champions, and work alongside global institutions, national and local governments, businesses, and civil society to turn data into action. Together, we're advancing accountability, environmental rule of law, and people-centered justice. Because the rule of law is the best way to ensure fair and just communities where everyone can thrive.
Welcome again, and thank you to those of you who are joining us here at the National Archives, home of the founding documents that codify these rule of law ideas here in the United States and inspire so many around the world. And thank you also to those of you joining us online. We appreciate you joining in our celebration of 15 years advancing the rule of law. I want to recognize the World Justice Project Board and officers and Leadership Council, our co-founders, William Hubbard and Bill Neukom, from whom you'll hear later today, and all of the other exceptional leaders who guide and support our efforts to advance the rule of law. I want to say a special welcome to Michelle Banky, the President-elect of the American Bar Association, and Mark Suchman of the American Bar Foundation, two institutions that were really critical to the founding of the WJP 15 years ago. Let me also thank the sponsors who make today's convening and WJP's work throughout the year possible. These include members of our private sector partnership for the rule of law. Those are Google, Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, Jones Day Foundation, K&L Gates, LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation, Microsoft Corporations, Perkins Coie, and Shell Global, and Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati Foundation. I also want to thank the institutions that are specifically sponsoring today's event, Google, Meta, and the law firms of Fredrickson and Byron, Morgan Lewis, and WilmerHale. Our WJP Rule of Law Index has documented a decline in the rule of law in a majority of countries each year since 2016. The global rule of law recession reaches every corner of the world, every region, and rich and poor countries alike. Last year alone, it affected over 6 billion people. 15 years ago, we could not have imagined the rule of law challenges we face today, both around the world and here in the United States, where WJP's latest research reveals shocking erosion in trust in institutions. To help us grapple with these challenges, we have two exceptional panels today. In the first, leading jurists will discuss the state of checks and balances so essential to the rule of law and how we can rebuild trust in institutions. In the second panel, we'll hear from general counsels from the private sector and the IMF about what the rule of law recession means for business and for economic prosperity. It's my pleasure now to turn over the microphone to William Hubbard, co-founder and chair of the board of the World Justice Project and dean of the Rice School of Law at the University of South Carolina, to introduce the panel and lead us off.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's a great honor for me to moderate this panel of distinguished panelists. I could spend the whole hour giving you the biographical backgrounds of these distinguished panelists, but I will keep it short because they have so much to say and I want to get into the substance. To my immediate left is Judge J. Michelle Childs. She's been a judge on the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals since 2022. She currently also serves as president of the Federal Judges Association, and she's a former chair of the American Bar Association Judicial Division. To her left is Judge Diane Wood, who had a distinguished career on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals and served as chief judge of that circuit from 2013 to 2020. She's now a senior lecturer in law at the University of Chicago School of Law and also serves in the very important position as director of the American Law Institute. And finally, to her left is Joshua Geltzer. Joshua serves as Deputy White House Counsel, as well as legal counsel to the National Security Council, and he previously was a professor of law and executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at the Georgetown Law School. Panelists, a recent World Justice Project survey of a nationally representative sample of Americans found a broad-based commitment to rule of law values, but deep skepticism that those values are honored in the United States today. 96% of the respondents said that they consider the rule of law essential for the future of our country, and 83% said that the president must always obey the law and the courts. However, when asked to give one word to describe the state of the rule of law today, the most common answer was corrupt. The data show an erosion in people's confidence in Congress and the courts to check executive power and erosion in trust in institutions more generally. The sharpest drop in people's trust related to the courts, long the most trusted branch. So I have a question to all three of our distinguished panelists. What do you think is driving these trends and undermining people's confidence in the rule of law in the United States today? And to what extent does this data reflect reality? Real erosion in the checks and balances that guarantee the rule of law? Or does the data reflect misperceptions about our institutions? And we'll hear first from Judge Wood.
Well, let me begin by thanking everybody, by thanking the organizers of this program, thanking Betsy, thanking William. It is such a privilege to be here to talk about this extremely important topic. And I'll begin by saying I'm afraid the answer to the question that William just posed is a little bit truth and a little bit not accurate information. And let me focus for a second about the courts, because that's certainly the branch of government that I know the best. For a very long time, maybe even when you all were younger and or less bombarded by what's going on with social media today, We thought the courts, were hearing the cases brought to them, thinking about the facts, thinking about the record, thinking about the law, coming up with decisions. And sometimes you liked the decisions, and sometimes you didn't. And I would say, at least in terms of my own life, it's always been clear that there are some hot-button issues that reach our Supreme Court that have a heavy policy, political, if you will, overlay. But that didn't seem to be depriving people of the confidence that the rule of law was being followed, even if it was, a Second Amendment case that you felt strongly about, or an abortion case that you felt strongly about, or a death penalty case, or any number of things. I'm sure you could add to that list. Because people thought the court was doing what it was supposed to be doing, and we had mechanisms to allow it to evolve over time. The drop in people's confidence in the court has been quite sharp, and here are a couple of the reasons why I think the answer is that there partly are facts behind it. Consider ethics. We've been hearing a lot about disclosures of things that seem like pretty nice gifts, and should they have been disclosed. I will remind you all that as the chief judge of my circuit, I spent 7 years with the responsibility of monitoring ethics compliance among every judge in the circuit, some 100 judges, the bankruptcy judges, the district judges, the Court of Appeals judges, and obviously if the problem had been me, it would have been the judicial council. So there's a quite elaborate system set up. There are rules that are quite accessible to people. There's an opinion, you can get an opinion from a committee, the Codes of Conduct Committee, before you even do something. If you're wondering, if I take this trip, is that going to be a problem? I actually sought their advice when I decided to take the directorship of the American Law Institute. I wasn't sure whether I could continue being a judge and do that, or whether it required retirement from the judiciary. And long story short, it required retirement, and I did that. But you can check in advance. Then there's another whole set of procedures for problems that have arisen if somebody has at least potentially crossed a line, and there's very careful adjudication of that. None of that happens at the Supreme Court. And this is something that our egalitarian society doesn't like. We feel like nobody should be above the law. That's part of the rule of law. It's maybe one of the most essential parts of the rule of law. And if you can just self-monitor without any external constraint, people don't like that. They don't really appreciate that this is all going to turn out well in the end. So I think that's in part a self-inflicted wound on the Supreme Court that is within its power to change. There's always a back and forth between Congress and the courts. Congress has threatened to pass a code of ethics. Congress sometimes talks about creating an inspector general for the federal courts. When I say sometimes, I mean they've nonstop talked about it for about the last 15 years, as far as I know. But there's a reason for this impetus, and if the courts want to be self-governing, they need to find ways of increasing confidence in what they're doing. I think a lot of it isn't so real. I know so many, conscientious state judges, conscientious federal judges. No one is worrying about whether they adjudicated your contract case or your insurance case, or even something as fraught as the redistricting of a state after a census. Most of what's done is done fine, and there are loud voices, but not necessarily a majority of voices that are portraying all of this as politics, where it really isn't. It is law. The judges are deciding it. I'll leave you with just one piece of evidence about that I found years ago. I wrote an article maybe about 10 years ago about how many times people wrote separately on the Court of Appeals. They wrote a concurring opinion or they wrote a dissenting opinion. And I looked at 10 years worth of data. I looked at data from all over the country. I looked at data from the Seventh Circuit. I looked at my own cases to see if I was any different from anybody else. The bottom line is 3% at the Federal Court of Appeals level. We have mandatory jurisdiction. I guarantee you that any 3 judges on our court, no matter what president appointed them, no matter what you thought they were going to think, most of the time there's this thing called the law that we're following, and there are no separate opinions. At the Supreme Court, it's 10 times that. It's more like 33%, maybe more than 10 times. And part of the reason is the cert docket. Part of the reason is they get to cherry pick which cases they think are the most fraught, the most important. But I wanted to go back to that 3% figure. The reality is the courts are functioning pretty well right now.
Judge Giles.
Thank you also for this opportunity, William, and then the World Justice Project, because you all are constantly continuing to defend and advance the rule of law around the world. And it's, as that video indicates, it's affecting everybody in their daily lives. I'm going to approach the question a little differently, just to start off with why the rule of law is so important. It's extremely important because it's vital to any well-functioning society. And when we think about it, particularly with the courts, there needs to be fairness and integrity in the courts, because that's our system of justice. That's the legal system. When the courts have fairness and integrity in them, then we then think that there's a good perception that our institutions are protecting our rights. And then when our institutions are protecting our rights, people tend to want to participate more in the democratic process because they'll feel heard, they'll be encouraged, and they'll feel like their participation is vital to advancing the rule of law in that regard as well. We need to give them that credit to then engage in civil discourse. Businesses will then feel that they have an opportunity to prosper, have economic growth, but then also be compliant. It will allow us to have the opportunity where people will then voluntarily follow the law, and so that we have a well-functioning society and that we are not resorting to lawlessness. So all of us at each level of the branches of government, as Judge Wood has said, have to be held accountable in that regard. Now, I'm sad to say that those statistics that William cited are dismal with respect to the courts. Well, I'll take responsibility for that, all of us, in the sense that we have to make sure that when people come to us for the court, we as judges are well prepared, people feel heard, and that means that we are giving them the opportunity that when they come to court, that they don't have a perception that we are activist judges, or that when they come to court that it is outcome oriented because we've already made up our mind, instead of giving advocacy to the lawyers to give the opportunity to adjudicate their claims in front of us, and then make up our minds in that regard after we go to conference and things of that nature. And so hearing the evidence, fairly articulating our position in well-reasoned decisions so that people can look at those decisions and accordingly govern themselves, that leads to peace and prosperity and for a well-functioning society.
Thank you, Judge Giles. Joshua Geltzer, from your position at the National Security Council, how do you see these challenges playing out globally, affecting the rule of law in other countries and in international relations and governance?
And let me start by echoing the other panelists and thanking you, William, thanking Betsy, thanking really everyone involved with this event and this organization for the chance to be part of this and the chance to be part of a really remarkable panel. I'm privileged to get to do so. Look, the fundamental notion that there is a rule of law challenge at home and abroad is very real. I agree with others up here in acknowledging that. And we do see it affecting our partners abroad. I'm going to give 2 examples, though unfortunately there are many. You know, those of us who came back to government with the current administration came back 2 weeks to the day after the events of January 6th, which did not look much like rule of law to audiences watching at home and audiences abroad. Now, we've done some things that we can come to later in the conversation to address a number of elements of those challenges, but the world was watching, and it did not take long for other countries to have what they describe, not we describe, they describe as their own version of January 6th. Brazil comes to mind as a prominent example, and unfortunately, as American diplomats in the wake of the new administration taking office, discussed whatever they wanted to discuss with foreign counterparts. A lot of those foreign counterparts wanted to understand January 6th and how it had possibly happened and what we were doing to make sure it never happened again. So one whole category, and again, there are more examples in this category, is the example we as a country, various actors within it, set or at least are taken to set by audiences that care a lot about fundamentals of American democracy, like the peaceful transfer of power. That may be the most fundamental. Then there's events in the world beyond and the question of how we and others respond. And again, there are plenty of examples of how the rule of law and fundamentally justice and accountability have been challenged over the past years, but Russia's brutal aggression against its neighbor in Ukraine is very high and perhaps tops on that list. The world is watching when one nation refuses to accept the sovereignty of its neighbor and in a barbaric way to annex it and resorts to horrific violence to do so. Now, we can get into some of the ways we have tried to mobilize like-minded countries to pursue accountability, pursue justice, and try to bring back the rule of law to a situation that fundamentally defies it. That's what a war of aggression is. But those are two big picture ways in which our diplomats and frankly all of us, when we engage with foreign counterparts, hear about these challenges. They look at what's happening here, they look at what's happening there, and then they want to know what we're doing about it.
Thank you, Joshua. Question for all three of you. What do you see as the most important antidotes? What strategies should different institutions adopt to restore trust and strengthen the rule of law? And we'll lead with the answer to that question with Judge Childs.
Well, I serve as president of the Federal Judges Association, and we're always grappling with just generally judicial independence. And what I mean by that is our ability to hear and determine our cases without fear or favor, without political pressure, and just the ability to hear them without anybody undermining our decisions. And one thing you'll notice is that the media plays a big part in this. The social media plays a big part in this, and so does artificial intelligence. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But when we're talking about the media, for example, there's been a big deal with people naming us by who we've been selected by, when that shouldn't matter, you know, in terms of are you Obama judge, Trump judge, Biden judge, or what have you. When we are delivering justice, we should be following the law, and the law should be neutral as its application applies to us. That in and of itself, by naming us, suggests a certain outcome or a certain predilection to how we're going to deal with our cases. And then, of course, with social media, if that's how people are getting their news, that is factored into a lot of decision-making, and then there's a lot of fraud, you know, within how that's done. And insofar as artificial intelligence, last night my husband and I were talking about a speech that I'll be giving soon, and he said, you know what, I just did something, and I put one of your old speeches into one of the artificial intelligence software. And so before he told me that, it gave this great commentary about the speech. And I was like, oh, that's nice. And he goes, guess what? That's fake news. And I said, what do you mean? He said, these are not even real people. And he said, just imagine if it were the other way. And so that's just an example of anybody believing it and taking that as being extremely credible in that regard as well. So those are the types of things that we have to think about when we're actually considering how people are receiving that. Now, federal judges, when I go back to the judicial independence, we're organizing ourselves to have kind of like champions of justice. And what I mean by that is we cannot speak about our ongoing cases. However, there is a civics education component that people need to understand about any case. So we're enlisting retired judges who have gained their First Amendment rights back. And those are the people who can just talk about process. We're not asking them to comment on the case, but perhaps what were the options to a judge, or perhaps what's the particular procedure, or the process in that particular case, or where it stands at that time. And also bar association members or lawyers standing up and defending certain things. Again, not speaking to the case or the facts, because that should go neutrally through the process in that regard. And so those types of things are helpful, because there's a lot of classes not even being taught in terms of civics or government anymore. So again, the resort to social media or the media itself is not a good thing in regard to how people are getting their news.
Judge Wood.
Well, it's a tough problem, but I think I'll move out just a bit from the judiciary, because we do have other branches of government. I have had the following experience more times than I can tell you. I will be with a group of some type. Maybe it's the American Law Institute members, or maybe it's members of other organizations, and we'll be having a dinner, we'll be having a meeting, there'll be a focus of some type. And people from all spots on the political spectrum will be there. I would say the same of my colleagues at the University of Chicago Law School. There's some people who are personally very conservative, there are other people who are very liberal or progressive, whatever word you want to use. And we'll have a serious conversation about a topic. And at the end of the conversation, somebody says, why can't our public discourse be more like this? Why can't we get beyond these deep divides where everybody thinks, if you're not on my side, you must be an evil, treasonous, some awful kind of person, and not realize that maybe just a difference of opinion on the issue at hand, whether it's immigration reform, whether it's tariff policy, whether it's whatever it may be. People have discussions about things like that, and they can do it without shouting at each other. And I think what we need to do is, in part, strengthen our community institutions, whether it's through the schools or through libraries, through things where people can actually encounter one another and feel good about it, feel that this has been a useful thing. We did this at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where we had a project on democracy about 5 years ago, and we held approximately 60 listening sessions around the country, where we would go to some communities were very small ones, some were big ones, get together a group of 20 volunteers. Sometimes it was all Trump voters, sometimes it was half Trump, half Biden, sometimes it was, sometimes it was people who'd never cast a vote in their life. And at the end of these sessions, every person said, this has been a great experience. I wish we could continue the conversation. They were respectful of each other. We need to find ways of fanning that flame back into existence. So let me just conclude by saying that our late colleague, who was the chief judge of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals when I was the chief in the Seventh, was Judge Robert Katzman, who was a leader in thinking of effective ways in which civic education, and yes, it's important in the schools, but it's important for adults too, the way that civic education could and has to be re-examined to address this problem.
Thank you, Judge Wood. Joshua Geltzer.
Let me give 3 examples, one done by the executive branch on its own, one done by the executive branch working with the U.S. Congress, and one done in close collaboration with foreign partners. And they relate to the 2 manifestations of rule of law challenges I mentioned earlier. So going back to January 6th, well, at the heart of the rule of law assault attack there was the turn to violence, the thing that democracies just cannot tolerate at their core, a sense that if you're unhappy with the result at the ballot box or in a court or wherever it might be, that you try to resolve it through violence. That tears apart the fundamental compact of democracy. So as an executive branch, we started on day 1 of the administration reviewing how domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremism is analyzed, understood, and approached, and released the country's first ever national strategy for countering it in June of 2021. It has a number of elements: understanding the threat better, investing more heavily in violence prevention, ensuring that our law enforcement is better postured to deal with it. Happy to go into greater detail on all of it, but fundamentally, attacking a problem, which is no matter what politics, what ideology one holds, one cannot turn to violence as a way of changing, altering, disrupting the course of democracy. That was critical. That we could do on our own as an executive branch. And we continue to work hard to implement and refine our implementation of that strategy. Second thing, also related in a sense to January 6th, we worked with the US Congress very quietly to do. To the extent there were intellectual underpinnings of what happened on the 6th, it was in the ambiguities of a very old statute that governed the proceedings that day. And while turning to violence is never acceptable, some of those who urged it on the basis that their reading of this statute, the Electoral Count Act, meant that there should be objections and things that happened that day that could be forced. Well, we worked in a bipartisan way with those on the Hill who recognized that that statute could be made clearer. The thresholds could be raised and clarified. The role of the vice president preceding that day could be clarified in a way that would at least reduce the ability to point to that as the basis for any sort of rallying cry reminiscent of what led or at least contributed to the violence of the 6th. And that became the Electoral Count Reform Act, and it's now federal law, and it's an improvement on the over century-old, quite confusing language that preceded it. That took two branches of government working together to get done, but it's done. And then the third example I'll point to, we have worked very carefully with the G7, with some of our closest foreign partners to get done, and it's still underway, but this relates back to Russian aggression against Ukraine. And the world saw that thanks to the support provided to Ukraine in part, but also to Ukrainian bravery, Russia was not able to win initially on the battlefield the way it intended. It now wants to succeed economically where it has failed to prevail militarily. And there are billions of dollars of Russian sovereign assets that have been immobilized, frozen in jurisdictions around the world. Some here, mostly not here. And we have worked very closely through the G7 with the legitimacy of those partners, aligning on a theory of international law, updating, working with the US Congress, our own domestic law through a law called the Repo Act, to be poised by the end of this calendar year to provide Ukraine with $50 billion that will go to their economic viability, drawing on certain immobilized assets. And that, to me, is an example of the rule of law in two ways. One, our approach to this, along with that of our partners, has been with respect for immunity, with respect for key concepts in international law, but also applying them to these horrific and very particular facts and circumstances. And second, to the extent it resists the fundamental flagrant violation of the rule of law that an invasion of one's neighbor represents, it helps contribute to reaffirming some accountability and some justice and some reaffirmation of the rule of law in the face of that.
Thank you so much. Staying with that topic of the elections, the World Justice Project's data also show widespread distrust of the electoral process, with roughly 1/3 of Americans saying that they will accept the outcome of the presidential race as legitimate only if their candidate wins. So my first question is to Judge Wood. The American Law Institute has undertaken several initiatives to shore up trust in the electoral process. Can you tell us about those and what you're trying to achieve there through those efforts, and what other steps you might recommend to be taken to ensure a peaceful, law-bound election?
Yes, I'd be glad to. It's a variety of projects, and just to remind the audience, the American Law Institute puts out work product of a couple of different types. You've all probably heard of the restatements of the law, and there's one thing in that category. We also put out somewhat more aspirational principles of law projects, which are better suited if there's maybe potential legislation happening, if there is federal-state overlap, because principles can be at a somewhat higher level of generality. And then finally, and this is a rather new thing for us, I call it member initiative projects. These are not projects that are actual ALI work product, but the ALI convenes groups when they come to us with an idea, and We think that this is going to be a nonpartisan, productive way of handling things. So actually, the Electoral Count Act reform followed one of those member initiatives. We put together a group co-chaired by Bob Bauer, who used to be White House counsel for President Obama, and also Jack Goldsmith and some others, people, well-respected and recognized people, and there were others too from all parts of the political spectrum. And they came out with principles that they thought reform of the Electoral Count Act ought to reflect, and took it over to the Hill. And as Josh says, there was widespread agreement, thank goodness, across whatever aisles there may be. Maybe they weren't aisles like these aisles, it was an aisle in the middle. And there were a couple of things, in addition to clarifying the role of the vice president, it addressed coming up with a single conclusive slate of electors. Who was the person who was going to say who they were? It was the governor, basically. There's a higher threshold for challenging while the count is going on. It used to be quite easy. And also further clarification of when you might have reason to disregard the results of an election altogether, a quote, failed election. So there's a lot in the new law that I'm very optimistic will allow this to go through more smoothly. There had been an earlier project that the ALI had on the principles of election administration, looking at non-precinct voting, looking at resolution of ballot counting disputes, and that may sound like that's in the weeds for you, but that's actually where a lot of the action takes place. We had another member initiative type project where we came out with ethical standards for election administration. So essentially a code of ethics for election administrators, and it included 7 core principles. The first one, adhere to the law. It's worth saying. Protect and defend the integrity of the election process. This helps get people trained so they know what they're doing as they administer the process. And it's their friends and neighbors who are going to their precincts. We have such a decentralized system of election that, that this is also actually a helpful thing. Maybe people will trust their neighbors where they won't maybe trust somebody who's halfway across the country. A huge issue, promote transparency in the conduct of elections. In a world where people are skeptical about whether this is going to happen in a legitimate way, the more transparent, the better. If people can see with their own 2 eyes what you're doing, they will be more likely to accept it. Treat people impartially, demonstrate personal integrity, and you get the picture. So that's one. And finally, we have a new project underway on the topic of election litigation. That's not going to be finished in time for a month from now, and a month plus. But very interestingly, when we proposed that, it was the state Supreme Court judges on our council who were very enthusiastic about our taking a look at it. The burden of this process has largely fallen on the state courts. The federal courts see their share as well, but the state courts have had a lot to do with it. And so the whole idea has been to make the electoral process something that people will have confidence in, again, win or lose, even if your candidate isn't the one that happened to win your district, your Senate seat, your presidential choice. It doesn't mean that the process itself was flawed.
Thank you, Judge Wood. Joshua, prior to your current role, you were focused on domestic security threats. What does that experience tell you about risks we face in this election season?
So, in a sense, we start from the premise that which people point to justify unacceptable violence is persistent at this point. They point to conspiracy theories, they point to developments in the world, real or imagined, that they insist require a response of violence of some sort. But those issues, and some of those hot-button issues, which then get distorted by various voices in our media and our politics as well, those get particularly salient in an election cycle. And so we start from this premise that we need to dedicate ourselves to this work of protecting from domestic violent extremism and foreign violent extremism of any ideology, of any type at all times. But I do think we approach a season like this and the remaining 37, 36 days, but even the part after, when there will still be counting and litigation to come, and hopefully the country has become a bit habituated to that over the last few election cycles, we approach that period of time with extra caution. Now, we respond by trying to get at, in some ways, the heart of your question, William, which is to reassure people that the election has security, it has integrity. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, a component of the Department of Homeland Security, works both off election cycle and on election cycle to help poll workers, state officials, volunteers, anyone with protecting themselves, protecting their personally identifiable information online, protecting the premises where they work, because all of these can be challenged right now by those who decide to believe the conspiracy theories or exhortations to violence otherwise that then can lead them to harass, threaten, or even attack. I'll also say one other thing, which is there are foreign actors out there who want to meddle in, who want to mess with our elections. And we have tried, as an executive branch, in this cycle, to be very transparent, to go to that word, to help the country understand at the level we can share it, which actors are trying to do what. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, have released periodic statements saying, here's what certain foreign actors are trying to do. And we've tried to show that we are bringing to bear all tools of national power to protect the integrity, the security of our elections. That includes law enforcement tools, that includes sanctions, it includes visa bans, it includes disclosure, which has caused actors to stop the activities they were engaged in once they were no longer covert, once people understood how they were moving money or how they were trying to influence and distort our domestic dialogue. So we think doing that, which is the right thing to do, but also showing that we're doing that is important.
Thank you, Joshua. Judge Childs, election disputes are bound to come to the courts this season, and the outcome may be determined in court. This will happen against a backdrop of the courts being increasingly perceived as partisan. What thoughts do you have about how we can rebuild trust in courts as nonpartisan arbiters and guardians of the rule of law?
Well, first we have to ensure that, particularly as federal judges, despite being appointed by one president or another, that we're only committed to the rule of law, not to a particular party, not to the president. But I would say that that goes the same with the lower courts. I mean, when you're in state procedures, you tend to run partisan, and you tend to project your views to get elected. And so there's no time or place for that, you know, in these particular elections in that regard. But another thing that I want to bring up that's been becoming an increasing concern is threats to the judges, personally and to our professional reputations. And it's gotten very serious in terms of physical threats. Many of you may have heard a few years back where Judge Esther Salas out of New Jersey, just being home, and then has a person who used to be a litigant in her court, comes with a gun, shoots her son, unfortunately kills the son, then also shoots her husband. He ends up having 15 or so surgeries, luckily alive. But now, thanks to her eagerness and her bravery, and through the help with the Federal Judges Association, various persons with the American Bar Association, the magistrate judges, federal, and others, we have the Daniel Anderall Act, which has scrubbed our personally identifiable information off the internet, because that's all he did. That gunman went to the internet and found her address and made it to her house. We have now also have upgraded security systems at our homes, and we've now taken it further to assist the state court judges in that regard. And this is just for doing your job. Many of us have had high-profile cases and have had a lot of security around us in that regard. Again, just delivering justice through your various decisions. And so we have to get back to judicial independence, but not threat to our independence and having fear of making the decision just by doing your job.
Judge Childs, just a follow-up. How does it affect one when you're in the presence of U.S. Marshals for 4, 5, 6 weeks? How does that affect your life?
It's very discouraging because you can't go anywhere without them knowing. I mean, even if I'm sitting in this room and I say I have to use the restroom, I mean, they're going to follow me. They're going to go and check out and scope the place. As I go to an American Bar Association meeting, there's somebody ahead of me, aside, in the back, in front. They're going to approach if somebody wants to hug you. I'm a hugger, you know. Just even things like that. And, it's all for our safety, but they're on such high alert. And again, it's just from the fact of you rendering a decision, trying to be very careful and deliberate about it. And we have to render our decisions. We have to do our work, but we should not fear and be under that threat and feel like there's going to be some harm to come to yourself or your family in that regard just from, rendering your decision.
Thank you, Judge Childs. The state motto of South Carolina is, "While I breathe, I hope." So let's try to end on a hopeful note if we can. So I'd like to invite each of our panelists to reflect on what gives you hope for the rule of law in the United States and around the world at this time, and how organizations like the World Justice Project and the community gathered here in the audience can help make those hopes a reality. So Josh, why don't you lead off on that, please?
I'm happy to start because these challenges are real. That's where our conversation began today, but I think the responses are real. And I've talked a little bit about strategies developed, implemented to try to get at pieces of this, about working in a bipartisan way between the executive branch and Congress to make our laws firmer and on some more solid footing. We talked about global, multilateral partnerships. But in some ways, I just want to look back to 2022 and where the issues we're talking about right now were real. They haven't been solved since then. They were also challenging that. And yet ultimately what happened that election cycle is that poll workers kept on volunteering, and in the face of threats and challenges, that the day went smoothly. There was not violence, even though there was much vitriol and much division about whom to vote for and what people wanted to see. And the country emerged, and the election results were in. And I'm not naive. None of us who work on this issue can be, given what we see from law enforcement, from the intelligence community. But we need to take each of these cycles as they come as a chance to put on display for ourselves and the world another data point, another instance of doing this thing we call democracy, doing it peacefully, and showing that we recommit ourselves to operating under a rule of law. I also think conversations like this one are important because they really weren't happening a couple decades ago when many of us took for granted, at least at home, some of the rule of law issues that we no longer take for granted. And to have 15 years of this wonderful organization contributing to those discussions and doing this work around the world, to me that shows that there is a recognition of this being so core to everything that builds upon the rule of law, and that gives me some hope.
Thank you, Josh. Judge Childs.
Sure, and thank you, World Justice Project, because you're interested in a global impact on justice, again, affecting our daily lives. And, even with the Federal Judges Association, some of us will soon be going over to South Africa for the International Association of Judges meeting, working on collaborative issues that affect all of us. There are several study commissions where we're all looking to best practices to share around the world, because that threat to justice here is a threat to justice there, and vice versa. I would also indicate that when we collaborate together and share ideas, while that's great, I'm very happy for these think tanks that bring people who have very divergent views together, because we need to speak to each other, hear each other, understand that we all have families, we all have shared practices, experiences, and views, and we have more in common perhaps than we realize. And we shouldn't let there be just a partisan divide or just social media driving our thoughts and our experiences to divide us in that regard. So the more that we can discuss and be around each other and just talk it through, I think we'll get closer to being together and having resolution.
Thank you so much. Judge Wood.
Well, all of those are important and great ideas, so let me just add a few things. One thing, actually, that gives me some cause for optimism for the future, believe it or not, is in the Citizens United decision. Because although the Citizens United decision shut down a number of ways in which campaigns could be regulated. The one thing that the court said there that the U.S. Supreme Court has stuck with since then, and that the state courts, I've just been checking, all of them actually, have stuck with, is that disclosure is the best disinfectant. If you are interested in who is contributing, if you're interested in expenditures, the way that we do it in this country with a vigorous First Amendment is through sunshine, is through disclosure. And I think we can take that and work with it. That'll make sure that maybe some of these unfriendly foreign actors who are attempting to interfere with our processes can't get away with it. There are people who are very good at figuring out who's behind what, and the law, of course, requires this as well. Another thing that I think we haven't talked about, but I'm just going to put it out there, I do think that there is reason to focus on the root causes of some of this disaffection. Those people who were mobbing the Capitol on January 6th, if you can kind of step back and say, well, what is it that people are feeling that the system is letting them down about? And take that seriously, whether it's, you know, sound policing practices. We actually have another principles project in the ALI on principles of policing, which is a very balanced document. But things that will make people feel that if they've got a problem, the thing to do is to resolve it through these mechanisms that we make available. So working on root causes, I think, is way open to us. And there may be another side of the social media. We tend to talk about it as though it's always the problem. But like many things in modern life, the same thing that's the problem is the solution. There are so many people who you can reach, so many ways of personal participation. And I debated whether I would mention Taylor Swift, you know, calling on people to register to vote, but her call reached a lot of people, and apparently there's quite an upsurge. But the social media platform allows people to network with their friends. It allows people to participate when maybe they don't have, you know, the time or the money, you know, to devote more resources to it. So I think we have a lot of ways of making sure that our system continues to work for us well, and I hope that in another 2 or 4 years we'll be able to say the same thing that Josh just said.
Judge Wood, thank you very much. One thing that gives me a lot of hope, if I may, is we have leaders like this in our country that still hold the institutions together, provide the proper leadership and direction for their organizations. And those institutions are so vital for to hold the fabric of democracy together and to strengthen the rule of law. So please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists today.
Thank you so much, William and panelists. That was really fabulous. I couldn't agree more. William said it perfectly. This kind of inspiration, commitment, and leadership is very inspiring and hopeful. Please stay where you are for 2 minutes or so. You may stand up and stretch, but don't wander off because we're going to quickly transition to our next panel and begin again very soon. Thanks again. Can I ask everyone to take your seats again? Thank you once again for being with us. We shift our focus now to the economy and businesses' interest in the rule of law. And I can't imagine a better lineup to help us do so than you have here before you. To moderate and introduce the panel, let me turn now to Judy Perry Martinez, WJP Vice President, co-chair of our Leadership Council, former ABA President, and former Chief Compliance Officer of Northrop Grumman. Judy.
All of you and to bring this wonderful panel here to discuss these important issues. Our panelists' bios provide a glimpse into their extensive leadership and the reach of their leadership, their commitment to the purpose of the rule of law, and so much more. And I urge you, if you want to be inspired, to take a look at those at your leisure. But because we have so much to talk about here this afternoon, I will just introduce them oh so briefly and ask you to go back and learn more about their extraordinary lives later on. So to my immediate left, is Horacio Gutierrez, the Senior Executive VP, Chief Legal and Compliance Officer of the Walt Disney Company. Horacio, welcome. Rhoda Weeks-Brown is next to him, the General Counsel and Director of the Legal Department of the International Monetary Fund. Rhoda, welcome. And finally, Bill Neukom, the former General Counsel and Executive VP of Microsoft and co-founder of the World Justice Project. Let's begin our discussion with something that's already been talked about here today, and always is the subject of much attention and discussion, and that is the meaning of the rule of law and why it matters. So I'm going to ask each of you that question, but I'll turn to Bill first, because Bill, you've led the work at the World Justice Project to craft a universally resonant definition of the rule of law, and it was a truly labor of love. And that widely now cited definition describes the rule of law as a durable system of laws and institutions and norms and community commitment that delivers 4 universal principles: accountability of both public and private actors, just laws that protect fundamental human rights, contract rights, and property rights, open government, and of course, accessible, impartial justice. So what aspects of the rule of law, so defined, are the most important to global investors and players? And I ask you each to give us an example, if you will, of the dimensions of the rule of law, or gaps in it, that have made or are making a difference in your work. Bill, I'll turn to you first.
It's hard to pick one of these 4 as being the most important. I think they make a quartet of disciplines that are essential. Without all 4 of them, I think it's difficult to have a growing economy or an inviting ecosystem in which to do business. I do think that if I had to pick one, I guess I'd start with accountability, but it's got to be accountability under a set of just laws as we've defined them in what we hope is a universal way. There was accountability in South Africa during the apartheid government, but under the wrong set of laws. There was accountability in the Third Reich, but under the wrong bad set of laws. But I think that notion that there are restraints on the power of government, there are responsibilities and rights for citizens, is perhaps the northern star of our definition of the rule of law. Open government's terribly important. Access to justice is terribly important. You wouldn't have rule of law without them. But I think the proposition that there's accountability of both public and private actors, and frankly, we always talk about the private actors as well as government, because some private companies have the power and the wealth of small countries, in this globe of ours, and so they have to be included. But I keep coming back to accountability, but under
a universally recognized set of laws which stand for just laws. And that has to mean, doesn't it, human rights, mean due process. We agonize. Is due process a universal enough concept so we can expect developing countries from the global south to appreciate due process? We think it is. We keep testing this when we're out there in the real world. And then open government is the best, I think, the best antidote to corruption, among other things. Earlier in the panel, you heard talk about sunshine dealing with corruption. I think that open government, so that the folks who are being governed know what the governors are doing in terms of making laws, amending laws, administering those laws, enforcing those laws. And finally, if there's not a way to resolve disputes between citizens and their government, between citizens and other citizens, you're not going to have a stable community of any sort. And who can do business there? So that's why we have all four of these in our definition, and I think they're all important, and I hope this monologue has helped you understand why we have defined it the way we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Rhoda, for your membership, tell us what you think are the most important aspects of the rule of law as we've defined them.
Sure. Well, thank you. And again, it's a huge pleasure to be here. It's a great discussion to be having, an amazing place to be having it. I mean, IMF, as you all know, and maybe I should just clarify at the beginning, but it's a international economic institution focused on issues. I mean, if I described our primary purpose, it's to help our member countries. There's 190 of them, from the US being the largest, to Tuvalu being the smallest, and everyone in between. But to help countries achieve macroeconomic financial stability, strong and sustainable economic growth, balance of payment stability. It's a little esoteric, but it's a very sort of macroeconomic focused mandate. So from our perspective, the aspects of the rule of law that we find most sort of relevant just for our operations, not as a general matter, but are those that have the most direct bearing on these kinds of macroeconomic outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. And what does that look like in practice? It spans a pretty wide range. It depends on the country you're dealing with. I can give lots of examples. If I step back and think of the core policies we've been emphasizing over the last few years, a big sort of policy change we made about 6 years ago was with respect to governance and anti-corruption, for example. So we had a policy for a very long time, but no one really was applying it. We're afraid to even use the word corruption because we thought that would sort of, it would not be a polite word to use with our membership. And then, of course, we realized that this was not sort of going to do it because in so many countries, getting it right on anti-corruption, on stronger judicial reforms, on stronger sort of rule of law measures writ large, really, to put in place the right sort of governance and safeguards, that would make a huge difference from a macroeconomic perspective. So we've ramped up that policy. I would also say it's not only about corruption. I mean, corruption is just a small part of the picture. It's really about all of these other sort of more core economic areas that you need to keep an eye on. They're kind of like the cracks through which corruption can come through. So what does that mean? We also look not just at that core corruption, but at things like, fiscal, policies, for example, market regulation, rule of law more generally. How do we define the rule of law in that context? Again, it's a narrower definition, but it's looking at things like the protection for property rights, contract rights. It's looking at the performance of the judiciary. What a wonderful panel we're having just right before us, but that's not the norm in many places. In many places, strengthening the judiciary has to be a pretty core part of that. Quickly, other things we look at, again, that matter for us, our economic perspective, rule of law, we're looking at things like debt transparency. Sovereign debt issues have been massive recently, not in the US, but there are many countries that are completely insolvent because they've overborrowed. Debt transparency, there's lots of hidden debt, stuff that no one even knows has been done. So again, strengthening debt transparency is a big issue for us. We're also focused on issues regarding women's economic empowerment. Again, so many laws that discriminate against women and that, if corrected, could make a huge difference in countries. So I'm giving you a very long list, Judy, because again, it's actually it's not so much that it's long, but it's diverse because there's a diverse number of issues affecting countries where if we got it right from this sort of so defined rule of law angle, it could make a massive difference from a macroeconomic and stability perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Horacio, any differences that you see from your perspective on what elements are
Well,
significant?
not necessarily differences, but perhaps areas of emphasis. I would start by saying that one of the things that I love about the definition of the WJP is the fact that it assumes that there's an element of law in action that results in a state of rule of law, as opposed to some formal requirement of the codification of rules and the existence of a judiciary and things like that. When he talks about a community commitment to the rule of law, it may sound like just an aspirational, nice statement. The reality is, in my experience, having worked in and lived in many places around the world, is that it is actually fundamental, that there is a commitment and an expectation by society that those rules are going to be upheld. And Bill talked about the private and public sector participation in that. In our experience, and now I will focus on the experience of a company operating for over 100 years in almost every country around the world, you know, we're called the House of Mouse. You know, it's a shorthand for the fact that it's a company created on the back of one character in a caricature that spawned first animation films and then an entire conglomerate of companies. And if it hadn't been for the international web of intellectual property protections, the treaties, the local enactment of laws, implementing those, and an effective mechanism to protect that intellectual property, you know, the company wouldn't exist. That wouldn't be possible. There was an example, one of the biggest movies we've ever released, one of the last Avengers title, there was an individual in a third world country that it was the relative of a censor, which by definition, you know, the censors get access to the content beforehand so that they can, you know, do their work and apply a rating and all those kinds of things. The individual had taped the film with a camera and had started to release it on the internet, which would have released the plot of a movie that we had guarded so zealously throughout that process. We were able to act very quickly because we were able to operate and navigate a system of rule of law where we knew what to expect and where to go and what steps to take. The other aspect of our business, so intellectual property, you know, for our industry, by the way, the creative industries represent 4.1% of the entire GDP of this country. That's $1.1 trillion of the GDP, and it's, you know, 3-point-something% of the GDP of industrialized countries around the world. So it's the value creation of the industry rests on a systems of rules and the will to enforce them in a fair and speedy manner. We're also one of the largest licensees of consumer products, plush toys and T-shirts and things like that. Then we face other kinds of things that have to do with our supply chain and the working conditions in the countries in which those products are manufactured and where does the cotton come from, and is forced labor involved. And there we operate in an area in which the government in many of those jurisdictions is not doing their part in terms of policing the working conditions of the employees and enforcing that age and even working week limitations and things like that. When you don't have that, what happens is that we, as the private sector, we have to create our own systems. We have our own responsibility to ensure that because we feel accountable to our stakeholders to do that. And what that means is in the absence of a functioning system of rule of law in the markets in which we're operating, we have to create an infrastructure that ensures that we're living up to those principles and those human rights that the definition refers to in the absence of the partnership of of the public sector.
So hearing the criticality of what you've been speaking about, and knowing that in the WJP's annual Rule of Law Index that tracks the decline in the rule of law at a majority of countries worldwide, every year since 2016, there's been a decline. And the declines are widespread in every region of the world, rich and poor countries, and across most of the factors that we track, the constraints on government powers, corruption, open government, fundamental rights, regulatory enforcement, the functioning of justice systems, we're seeing these declines. And so we have characterized at WJP this decline as a rule of law recession. So a question to each of you: how do you see this erosion in the rule of law you told us, gave us a glimpse a minute ago, Horacio, affecting global business and investors and the economies? And what do you think that institutions and businesses, institutions such as IMF, should do about it? And Bill, I'm going to turn to you first, because this decline we're seeing, we know, impacts an awful lot of things, and it impacts economies. So I think you have a slide maybe to share with us.
Yes, I do. If we can put it up, please. This is a scatter plot, and it shows a simple truth. Where you have stronger rule of law, at least as we define it, you're going to have a stronger economy. More rule of law, higher GDP. It's a perfectly straightforward notion, and it makes sense to us in the field, but it also, I think, is almost self-evident. One of my favorite stories, or least favorite stories, is a friend of mine who at the time was general counsel at Costco, and he was in China, and they were up on a hill looking out at a great big box below them. And the Chinese government official, not picking on the Chinese government, but said to my friend, "You see that box? That could be yours." And my friend said to me, that sent a shiver down my back, because I knew that if that box was mine, that same government official could have somebody from the next company saying to him, that box down there could be yours. Contract rights, property rights, pretty essential stuff. And Horacio and I shared an experience for a number of years when he was doing extraordinary work at Microsoft. He was in charge of all of Latin America for us for quite a while. And one of the realities of the information technology business was that Microsoft was fortunate to get early and good in terms of developing markets. But then in order to grow your revenues, you got to go to not developed markets, but developing markets. And those are countries which tend not to have as much rule of law as the more developed economic countries might have. So you're dealing with real problems in terms of how you can persuade those folks in those marketplaces to deal with you in a rule of law framework. And the other thing that we've learned at WGP as we go around the world and meet largely in developing economic countries is that we hear this refrain: we don't just want aid, we want trade. The problem with aid is you become a supplicant, and you depend upon the generosity of third parties. If you're in the trade business, if you have a domestic economy which can create goods and services which are in demand other parts of the world, you then are a participant, and you have jobs for your folks, and you have income for them and opportunities for them. So we have been mindful of the notion that one of the things that works in a rule of law globe is that the rule of law works for developing countries who want to grow their economies for the benefit of the folks living in that country.
So Rhoda, how does IMF help countries who are trying and struggling and who want to do the right thing and they're struggling to stop this decline?
Well, I mean, I would say it takes two to tango, so to speak, right? So again, it is working really closely with those countries. I love Bill's chart because again, in some ways it articulated the point I was making earlier, but about this link, and again, the reason why these issues matter so much. I mean, we do a number of things. We provide, again, the IMF sort of sort of natural role of what we do, our main activities, threefold. Lending, that's what most people think of us as doing, and we provide quite massive amounts of financing, including to some of the countries that were being discussed earlier. But also we provide just routine economic policy advice. We have an annual economic discussion with all of our member countries where we give advice to everyone targeted to whatever the issues are in that country. We also provide a lot of capacity development, because again, it's one thing to say what needs to be done, it's another thing to help them to do it. And what does that look like? Again, I alluded earlier to some of the issues we focus on. I mean, clearly strengthening the judiciary is a key part of this. Again, this is not a new thing for us, and these issues really, they're sort of the old, new again, and sort of always there in some ways, right? I joined the IMF during the Asian crisis, and if you remember what that crisis was in, the late 90s, it was basically a currency crisis. The currencies collapsed. Companies in Indonesia, Korea, Thailand, a couple of others had borrowed pretty massively in foreign currency, and then with the depreciation of their own currencies, they were all insolvent. And so if you look at it from a pure just economic lens, you need a system to restructure all of those insolvent companies. You need some sort of procedure for that. So that's what we did in those countries. So what did that mean? Putting in place out-of-court restructuring mechanisms, strengthening the bankruptcy law. But it didn't stop there, because like I said, the judiciary is a key part of that. So we're also working on judicial reforms, out-of-court restructuring mechanisms. But again, the issue of the strength of institutions and the judiciary is really a recurring one, because again, and it's not just about, having the right judges, it's training, it's staying through the long game. There's also, again, in all of those countries and in the work we do now, again, similarly with judicial reform and other pieces, but a key part has also been this broader anti-corruption effort that I talked about. You need, again, all of these multiple parts to work together. I keep coming back to some of the more boring kinds of governance safeguards that many of these countries also need. Again, things like public financial management, how are expenses being made, how do you track what's happening? That box that the guy talked about, who did that belong to? How do you track it? How do you know when it's being misused? It's very kind of, wonky kind of stuff in some ways, but it's really critical. And if more countries could get it right in those areas, it would make a huge difference. So it's public financial management, it's, sort of other areas around like AML, CFT, just stronger anti-corruption frameworks, even things like financial sector regulation, market regulation, what sort of procedures are in place. So the answer to the question is simply that we see this as a multifaceted effort. On the one hand, that chart matters a lot. And again, if we could get it right, the rule of law in these forms that I'm emphasizing, which have the sort of direct fiscal, financial sector, growth kind of effects that, that matter. But it requires a lot of advice and assistance, but really it also requires counterparts in those countries that want to move the needle, because you can't really get this done if you don't have willing counterparts. So for us, a lot of that is giving the advice, encouraging the development, using it as conditionality in lending when that's appropriate. But again, we really do need partners. I was in a big conference with a lot of our fellow general counsels, Horacio, and I made this point that more corporate general counsels and more corporations need to partner on these issues as well. It can't just be the, the NGOs like you and the international organizations like us. I think companies have a lot of leverage, and I'm glad to see that more and more are getting more involved in these rule of law issues, recognizing the business aspects, not just the sort of, philanthropic or, aspects. So let me stop there.
And then I should mention that we have worked with the IMF in the context of the Better Work program, which is a program they have to establish certain standards for working conditions in factories in developing countries.
Probably the World Bank.
With the, I'm sorry, that's right, with the World Bank. And, our standards, for example, in countries that fall in the bottom quarter of the stack ranking of the World Bank, we won't do business there unless it is with a factory that has been part of the Better Work program. So that's a good example of international institutions, private sector, and to a certain extent the local government, who has to make certain commitments internally, really make up for some of these flaws in the system. I mentioned already the obvious consequences, which I mentioned in my prior answer, is when you don't have those systems, you have to make up for them. You need the transparency, you need the governance, you need the accountability, the audits, and those kinds of things. That is expensive. That makes a market less attractive as an investment opportunity or as a source of products or raw materials or the other. So there are economic consequences for the absence of reasonable rule of law in a country. But then I'll make the final point. It is a mistake to believe that this is only an issue for foreign countries. There are serious rule of law questions in this country too. You know, when you think of the politicization of the judiciary, including the Supreme Court, I mean, we face, in some cases, we got into a little spat with the governor of Florida a couple of years ago. And the notion of it really matters who the judge was. It always does, of course, but it really mattered the political leanings of a judge in terms of how a decision was going to come out. And it should not be that way. And you could say in some ways it's worse than it was before, or if you've lived long enough, you probably say, well, there's always been some of that to a certain respect. But the reality is it is a very fragile equilibrium. And we are living at a very dangerous time in terms of the desire to compromise the independence of the judiciary and to bend the creation and implementation of rules and regulations in a way that pursue political aims rather than other objectives.
Judy, if I may,
Sure.
just
Go
very
ahead.
quickly, on top of Horacio's insightful comments, if there is a recession worldwide in adherence to the rule of law as we define it, a contributor to that, I'm afraid, is the decline of the adherence to the rule of law in this country, as he said. We have been the beacon. If you go to a developing country, the reason that they should get rule of law is because that's part of what makes the U.S. so prosperous. And for years and years, we could use the U.S. as an example of the advantages of having a rule of law system and a market economy. And that example, that beacon is dimming. And so Horacio's right. It's not just these other countries who we are, I think, causing some of the decline because we can't go to these other countries and say, be like us. You want success like us? Then you have to do rule of law. They're entitled to say, what is this that we hear about what's going on in the U.S., both in terms of politics and government and some of the business practices? So it does start at home for us.
So we all know that in your positions, you each use the tools that you have in your chest to do your work in your tool chest. And one of those tools we know is the WJP Rule of Law Index. So Rhoda, if you can share with us how you've been using the index in your work at IMF, and how do you, I think importantly, how do you convince or advocate to others in your organization about the importance of the index, because you've now become, I believe, a believer.
Well, the good thing with my role is I'm a believer. If I'm a believer, then the institution sort of, in some ways, is as well. I mean, we actually use this in a pretty integral part of our analysis. Again, that governance policy I referred to earlier that looks not only at corruption, but again, it looks at a wide range of things, including the rule of law. So we use the WJP's index. It's the one focused on, I think it's civic engagement. I was looking at my notes to find the exact, that category. But we use that almost, and we see what your ratings look like in that respect when we begin looking at our countries, right? So it's kind of a starting point. We see what it looks like and what sort of factors you've sort of identified in coming up with your own analysis, again, that you do for all countries. But we use that as a starting point, and then we do our own deep dives. Again, for many countries, I mentioned those annual conversations we have, so we're talking to people on the ground. Again, that gives us what to focus on, and again, we think it's very effective. As you know, we're using other indicators previously, so we've now switched to the WJP for this part of the rule of law analysis. Again, and then, but that gives us the opening bit. And again, and then on that basis, like I said, we go down, we do the more detailed analysis, and what we do in each country depends upon where the gaps are. So I was just looking at some of our examples. You know, for example, in DRC, the focus there for rule of law, economic governance is around things about just strengthening the visibility of the laws, having a central repository of laws. In other countries, it's around issues like how you document and take care of land ownership and transfers and that sort of thing. Independence and integrity of anti-corruption commissions, again, huge issue for a number of countries. Also anti-corruption prosecution services, but again, drawing on that initial analysis and then doing deeper dives. And I should say that the range of countries for which we do these things, again, there's this general discussion of, you know, developing countries, advanced economies. I do agree with the point made earlier, by the way, that more and more of these discussions are a bit more complicated. Because, you know, in the old days, when I first started doing this, we pointed to the US. Obviously, we always had a broader sort of point of reference, but this was always the starting point. And you do get questions in some cases. Sometimes they're kind of, you know, sort of teasing or joking, but just this fact. So again, I'm just saying it is there, but it certainly hasn't impeded in any way our own work. But we're having these conversations and covering a broad range of these areas. The one other thing I wanted to mention, anti-corruption commissions, I just want to make the point that the range of countries is quite diverse, right? So for example, even a country like Ukraine, that's a country we've been doing a lot of governance and anti-corruption reforms in, and we continue that even today, and the authorities have been quite keen on drilling down on those issues and making progress even in the current circumstances. So it's actually a pretty broad range of countries where we have these discussions. The final quick thing I wanted to mention is one new development that's helping a lot, at least in some countries, and we think holds promise, is this whole idea of GovTech, which is technology that can be used to address some of these governance kind of areas I had talked about before. Again, it's not a magic wand, like all technology can be misused, and if the wrong people get their hands on it, it can be used for the wrong reasons. But it has been quite helpful in a number of areas in bringing more accountability in some aspects of public financial management and this sort of fiscal issues. Thank you.
You know, one of the beauties of the Rule of Law Index is the interactive tool. And if you haven't explored it, and any of our members of the audience have not explored it, it is fun. And you talked about wonky before. Maybe I've become more of a wonk, but it is fun to look at it and to play with it because it slices and dices the data in a way that can be so helpful depending on what you are particularly looking for as you explore these aspects of the rule of law. Horacio, one of the challenges, of course, that we are all very aware of today is the scourge of disinformation. And it has disrupted elections, it has fomented hate and discrimination, both with neighbors, with family, and beyond. And it undermines the trust in so many different institutions. At the same time, certain responses to disinformation can themselves pose additional threats to the rule of law and how that response is made. And it can pose a threat to fundamental rights, if you will. So as general counsel of a company that is in the information business, how do you see and respond to those challenges?
Well, this is a topic on which we could spend a long time. You know, obviously it is a serious problem, exacerbated by the changes in terms of the way in which people consume news and consume information and the echo chambers that are created by the micro-targeting of advertising and social media platforms and a number of other things. It's a combination of things. It is a reality and it exists, and we've seen how it's operated in ways that are quite concerning. The fact that it is a problem doesn't end the conversation, doesn't mean immediately there's a role for government in terms of stamping it out, because as you said, you know, the Constitution, particularly in this country, is very clear in the First Amendment that the government shall not enact any laws that are going to interfere with the freedom of speech. We had a case in the Supreme Court recently in Murthy versus the Surgeon General, in which the court, on the one hand, upheld the freedom of speech of the individuals, and at the same time indicated that it was okay for the platforms themselves to take steps, but that the government shouldn't necessarily censor. And they did that in finding that the government trying to use influence to persuade platforms to self-curate the content was in fact not a violation of free speech. So it's an interesting way of approaching it, but that is, you know, freedom of speech is such an important cornerstone of the rule of law around the world that we need to be comfortable with that. Now, having said that, not everything that one can say is necessarily legal speech. You know, there is hate speech, there is you know, incitement to violence, there is you know, speech that can lead to bodily harm of individuals and things like that. And then the responsibility of platforms is really to try to weigh those things. Imagine the situation in which it puts us. The government constitutionally cannot really regulate speech outside of where the Speech Act violates the law in some well-defined manner, and yet we, unelected private sector company people, are called on to make these choices about what crosses the line, what would be harmful, and then what is the criteria for that? Is this a legal criteria? Is it a corporate image criteria? Is it a user satisfaction criteria? So it's an incredibly balancing act in which the best answer for us has been to really have a set of principles that we believe in and be consistent in the application of those principles and have a reasonable level of transparency as to what those principles are. And the other part from our end is we also have a journalistic news organization in the form of ABC News. And we also think that the other thing that we can do in the private sector is, at a time like this, in which there is so much disinformation, it is more important than ever that the journalistic function and the professional gathering and distribution of news be done according to the ethical standards that journalistic institutions should abide by. So now, obviously, we're also the network that's being told that fact-checking clearly wrong statements by a candidate is political bias, but that is the world in which we live in. But then the question is, what are our principles, what are our values that we will apply consistently, which will transcend the particular political moment in which we are in, and they're just honoring those professional tenets.
So your portfolio is so wide and deep. We'll be thinking about you in the days to come. Let's turn to another topic that's gotten much attention of late, and that's ESG concerns, environmental, social, and governance concerns among global businesses and investors writ large in recent years. And now we're seeing what some may call a backlash against the agenda in some quarters. How do you see the rule of law relating to ESG? And can the rule of law provide a helpful framework for advancing or perhaps maturing ESG? Bill, I'll turn to you and think about your Microsoft days as well as the work you're doing now.
Sure. Part of my thinking about this comes from serving on the board of a public company, an information technology company, as well as my time at Microsoft, and just being an aware citizen. I think it's fair to say that the rule of law is important for business. Business is important for the rule of law because there is this awakening, in the best sense, I think, of well-managed companies that what I like to call corporate social responsibility is one of the priorities of a well-managed company. And it's because if you believe in and you practice and promote corporate social responsibility, or call it ESG, call it whichever you like, that is good for business. There's this whole new term of sustainability, and it's confusing because you just ought to stick with the basics, I think, and that is what mix of social responsibility should be on the agenda of a company. And the answer, I think, is a fair amount. And when it's done right, when a company like a Disney, or I'd like to think a Microsoft, is developing its strategic planning, it should be thinking about being more than a company designed to bring returns to its shareholders. I live in a town which was the headquarters for the Boeing Corporation for a number of years. I dare say that is a corporate Greek tragedy of a company. They were one of the world's great engineering companies in the history of industrial production. They were among the very best. And they have been led more recently by some senior staff and by a board that has been more concerned about their stock price than the quality of their product. And the results are awful and they're obvious. And so it seems to me that, businesses, the enlightened businesses, are playing the long game, and they realize where corporate social responsibility fits into their agenda. And if I, without meaning to romanticize it, Horacio, I wonder what you think about this. I like to think at this company on whose board I sit that we can use the workplace as a classroom. And if we're being environmentally smart at the workplace, that goes home. Hey, maybe there's too much plastic in our household. Maybe we ought to be careful about irrigating our yards. Those kinds of questions, I think, can be taught. Answers to those questions should be discussed at the workplace, and examples can be set by the company that go home and then out into the community. So Milton Friedman had a theory, and it played pretty well and pretty strong for a long time. But I think Horacio used the term stakeholders. That's a way of describing what I think a smart corporation does. It thinks about all the stakeholders that are essential to its existence and to its success. And that means some social responsibility. And why not teach at the workplace?
So my experience, Horacio, is that companies learn from each other, and they watch what each other do, and they learn the good and the bad. But how can we at WJP help companies in what they're all doing collectively and individually, which is, I believe, a maturation, going through a maturation of the ESGs?
Well, let me say two things. I'll come back to your point about what you can do. On the issue of what you're talking about, I think you're 100% right. And also keep in mind that a company's sort of commitment to ESG causes, different companies do it for different reasons, but one shouldn't ignore the fact that one of the big stakeholders that has increasingly gotten a louder voice is the employee stakeholder. And that as those employees are younger employees, they're millennials, and they're Gen Xers and Gen Zers, there is an expectation that the place where they work will share certain fundamental values with them. And your ability to hire these people, to maintain them, to retain them, to motivate them to be their best at work depends on this. I mean, it can be taken too far to a certain extent, but when we think about that, we think about it not only from what's good for the planet, which is obviously a very important point, but what is good for our employees, and then for a company particularly for whom so much of the focus is children, how can we not think about our impact on the ecosystem and the environment in which they're going to grow up and live? So for us, it's like a natural. It would be unnatural for us not to do those things. Now, should governments be regulating the detail on how certain things be done, when in reality, a lot of these questions, the answers to a lot of these questions depend on the emergence of technologies that don't exist yet, and it's really a process, and it needs to be a long-term process. There's a lot we need to learn yet, but and then I come back to your point, the issue of disclosure and transparency about these things, and the focus of ensuring that the statements companies make are based on fact as opposed to just PR, those things are legitimate. And I think the role that the WJP and other organizations can play is really, which by the way, you've done beautifully in many other areas, is to create the repository of the data of not only public and private sector, but the trends that are being generated so that companies like ours can rely on that, can enrich it, and there can be a feedback loop that makes us all better in understanding how to get there in a way that makes sense from a business perspective.
Good point. Rhoda, in my view, no task is more important than ensuring that the society's commitment to the rule of law is durable and that it lasts well beyond any of us in this room. And thinking of the young people in your organization and the young people that you come in contact with among your stakeholders, what, if anything, do you see changing, and there may be nothing, but changing in how they think about and value the rule of law and justice and democracy? And do you think, as a second question perhaps, do you think that the WJP's definition of the rule of law that was laid out earlier, that we've been speaking about, will change over time?
I mean, I think, I don't think there's anything wrong with the definition as it stands, but I think some of the factors we've been discussing here, you know, whether it's the seeming erosion in the respect for the rule of law, including in places where it had not been seen before, whether it's the more broad sort of, you know, set of developments that are happening that, again, make people, on the one hand, recognize the importance of it, but maybe wonder whether that commitment exists. Again, my fear when it comes to these issues is that, you know, we not get to the point where people no longer believe in the importance and the effectiveness of the rule of law. And again, we haven't done any detailed studies or analyses of it, so I'm not citing a particular report. But again, my sense, and again, I have enough young people that I talk with, is there is an increasing amount of, maybe cynicism is the wrong word, but some sense that things aren't quite as they should be, and maybe, you know, maybe that's not, you know, that their own belief in the existence of the rule of law could be affected in some ways. I think, you know, the increasing, from our perspective, we also see increasing, you know, just fragmentation among, you know, countries in general, sort of geoeconomic fragmentation, geopolitical fragmentation. And that too, again, in its own way will continue in some ways to call into question, again, to raise these kinds of questions I was referring to earlier. The economic costs of these kinds of practices we've seen recently, again, I'm talking about things around trade, for example, you know, reshoring, friendshoring, onshoring, sort of different ways that countries have been arranging their economic arrangements in more recent times, given, you know, the greater fragmentation out there, and the economic costs of those kinds of activities, and the implications of that for people, including in those countries. We're looking at an increase in trade restrictions. I just found the number. So countries imposed 3,000 trade restrictions in 2023 alone. And this was up from about 1,000 just a few years before that. And that number is really increasing daily, right? And so also you have the increasing concern about just fragmentation in the international financial system more generally. The numbers, again, can get pretty big in terms of the impact of this. Our IMF staff, for example, have estimated that greater international trade restrictions could reduce global GDP by as much as 7%. That's about $7.4 trillion. That's the combined GDP of countries like France and Germany. So we're talking about a lot of money. We're talking about a lot of sort of economic fallout. And again, I'm going back to your question in terms of what sentiments people have towards the rule of law. And again, I think that's, to some extent, that's one of the questions we have, to what extent these kinds of developments can have a negative impact. Again, I do think in some ways it also reinforces the need for us to be forceful on these issues, whether it's the kinds of, you know, focus on judicial reforms, focus on broader governance in the fiscal, financial sector in these areas we talked about before. I think there's a strong reason to drill down even more on that. But I think talking to people in countries, and again, we've seen lots of protests in the streets recently in places, again, countries from Kenya, a number of countries where, again, a lot of this is responding to some of these developments and greater just concerns from citizens about rule of law issues and what that means for common people. So I don't have a very positive sort of answer to your question about young people. I think it's a complex picture, and I think the young people following these developments will have these kinds of questions. But again, I think that's where all of us in this room come in our own respective ways, to continue to push for the kind of reforms that could make a difference, at least in some countries. Thank you.
Horacio.
Well, you know, I have this view that, you know, I agree that there is a global rule of law recession. And that's, you know, for the most part, the action of ideologies and governments and, you know, political considerations that have developed in this country, in Europe, in Latin America, and other parts of the world. But I actually think that because there has been a retrenchment in terms of rule of law, that young people are becoming more sensitive to the importance of that. Just think about the reproductive rights discussion in this country. Do you think young women are not thinking about rule of law and not thinking about the significance of one decision that had stood for decades in there, or whether it's a voting rights issue, or, you know, the immigration topic, or others? You know, I was born in a country where there was a failure of a peaceful transition of power because the government in power did not recognize the overwhelming winner of the election. Do you think the young people in that country don't see it and don't see the importance of their constitutional rights, and that their exercise of their right to vote and to exercise the sovereignty of the country through the vote is not important? Unfortunately, I think that awakening of the young generation is the result of the recession that you're talking about. Is the, you know, but I actually see, and I'm optimistic about the fact I have 3 kids from the ages of 20 to 30, and they're thinking about these things, and they're talking about these things, and they get mad about things, and they want to express it, and they want to engage. And to me, that's a hopeful thing.
So the glass half full is that all of the significant challenges that we've seen may give us opportunity to engage them even more so in the long term. Right. We only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, and I want to end as we did, following William's lead on ending the panel on a hopeful note, and I'll follow his lead to a greater extent. And while I'm not going to cite my state motto from Louisiana, I will do this and share one of our, a derivation of a, I guess, or an offshoot of one of our favorite terms, which is le bon temps roule, let the good times roll. And so what I would ask each of you is to think about how we let the hopeful times roll. And what's the greatest thing that gives you hope about the rule of law as we sit and live it each and every day? Horacio, go ahead.
Maybe I'll just rephrase what I just said. The fact that people nowadays, in these complex times, appreciate the significance that the absence of rule of law has on their lives, and the fact that they are engaging makes me very hopeful about it.
Thank you. Rhoda?
Well, I guess with the glass half full and half empty, we should go for half full. So I do think, again, it has raised the points I made earlier. Now one can either sort of be seized by the moment and therefore push for and achieve change, or be discouraged by the moment and retreat. So again, let's hope it's the former. And I think there's a lot of, it could go either way. But but certainly the awareness raising itself maybe is enough. So I am hopeful, but I think it requires a lot. And again, in some countries, at least the kind of countries that we operate in, it really is a long game in terms of, you know, bringing about and then sustaining the rule of law. It's a long game. It requires a lot of attention and a lot of effort. I'm glad that so much attention is being paid to these issues right now also, just more generally, and therefore maybe that will also help in those places as well. So it's optimism, but cautious optimism, and recognizing a long list of things that we all need to do together to make that work. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bill?
Well, I'm betting on business. Taking seriously the new philosophy of corporate social responsibility, because I think it is not opposed to profits and growth, but I think it is essential to it. And so I think there's an emerging role for business to lead communities towards more rule of law for the right reasons. As we go around the world talking with folks, there is this notion, to be a little philosophical, that the rule of law is the light side of human nature. And the lack of rule of law is the dark side of human nature. And I'm betting on human nature that people want freedom. They want opportunity. They want peace in their hearts and souls. And finally, I will say that try this on your book clubs. Try it at your churches and synagogues and mosques. Ask your friends, for the first time in our lifetimes, we are facing, and the youngsters in particular, are facing existential threats to civilization. These are unprecedented times we live in, and the youngsters are aware of it. My middle school granddaughter said to me, "Are we sleepwalking?" Middle schooler. And so ask yourself this, ask your friends this, what worries you most? You only get to pick 3, so I'll just throw 3 out. There's this thing called climate crisis. Is that real? Of course it's real. We can no longer deny that. What about the next pandemic? There's going to be another pandemic. Gates told us we were barely prepared for this one, and there's going to be another pandemic and another pandemic and another pandemic. This could kill hundreds of thousands and millions of human beings, innocent human beings. Is it any and all forms of invidious discrimination? What worries you the most about our future? And then ask yourself, what form of government, what kind of a community is most likely to deal with those existential threats? And the answer is a rule of law compliant government. One that's open, one that believes in just laws, one which believes in accountability and has a way for folks to resolve their disputes. That's my answer. Why do we think this is so important? Because it is the platform, it is the foundation for communities of justice and opportunity and peace. And in these times, that message, I think, is clearer and more powerful than ever. And we spent a lot of time at the project agonizing about what is universal and what is timeless. We do play the long game, and we don't always get it right, but we want your suggestions for ways in which we can be more universal and have values that are more timeless, and find ways to teach that in hopes of improving the lot of all kinds of folks on this little globe of ours. Thanks.
Well, one final thought.
Please.
In commenting about the long-term sustainability of WJP, in the journey for achieving justice and rule of law, we are like Sisyphus, condemned to push a rock up a hill only to have it roll back down. It's a process that never ends. There's a pendulum swing in terms of the commitment of nations and people to the rule of law, and the pendulum will continue to swing, but the work that you're doing is more important today than ever. So thank you.
Well, thank all of you, and let me just ask you to join me in thanking our extraordinary panelists who are beacons of light, shining the light on the rule of law across the globe, and we are all watching next what you will do. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you, panelists, for that exceptional discussion. And clearly, we can hear that the rule of law matters, and there's great hope in the kind of partnership that WJP can forge with institutions like the IMF and the private sector to continue to advance it. We at WJP believe very firmly in the power of partnership and enjoy great collaboration with colleagues and organizations across the globe, many of whom could not be with us here today, but sent their expressions of appreciation and best wishes. And so we're going to close out now with a little video of some of those greetings from our friends.
Congratulations to the World Justice Project on 15 years of extraordinary service. The World Justice Project is so important because it unites us globally in undergirding one of the most important pillars of any democracy, the rule of law.
The rule of law touches people's lives in many ways. You make that visible and measurable, highlighting trends and working with everyone from governments to grassroots organizations developing new solutions. Congratulations, World Justice Project, on 15 years of great work.
But faithfully including the art and freedom of artistic expression in your activities, you highlight the vital truth that cultural rights are human rights. Thank you very much for your unwavering commitment and leadership in fostering a more just and equitable world.
Happy 15th anniversary WJP when it comes to protect the rule of law with data, networks, capacity building. You are one of the most important organizations in the world. So you inspire us, you help us to do a better work in the field.
Thank you to everyone involved at the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index for creating and maintaining an invaluable tool for policymakers, for human rights advocates, and for businesses.
Thanks to you, we know what the problems are at the country level and where the gaps are. OGP deeply values the World Justice Project for its deep dedication to making the world a more just place. Happy anniversary.
El índice sobre el Estado de Derecho del World Justice Project es un referente esencial para la transformación del Poder Judicial Dominicano y para lograr una justicia al día para garantizar la dignidad de las personas en nuestro país y en la región. Felicidades.
Many of you may know that MCC produces scorecards annually to assess the eligibility of our country partners for support from MCC. WJP is a critical partner in this effort, and we are immensely grateful for your contribution. Thank you for helping MCC in its mission to alleviate poverty through economic growth. Many happy returns and happy birthday.
Felicidades World Justice Project por el enorme trabajo que han hecho en estos 15 años para fortalecer el Estado de Derecho y la posibilidad de una justicia centrada en las personas.
It is impressive what you all have been able to accomplish in 15 years. Whether it be the research and scholarship you all provide or the convening power you have to bring some of the smartest legal minds together, you have really helped secure the rule of law around the world.
Without the rule of law, there's no civilization. So please keep doing what you're doing and happy birthday.
World Justice Project, happy 15th birthday. Thank you for bringing together the global rule of law community.
Congratulations, Betsy and the team, on this amazing achievement. We look forward to continuing to partner with you to advance the rule of law and access to justice to promote peace and sustainable development.
Thanks so much for our founder, Bill Neukom, to the board of directors and our wonderful team. Congratulations to all.
Many thanks to all of you who are here with us today, and let me invite you to a celebratory reception upstairs in the entrance hall where you came in, and we will continue the reminiscing and the celebration. Thank you.